Tariffs. Everybody is talking about them today, right?
All in the headlines, all over, the media. Obviously, the market's paying attention. We thought it would make sense just to share, our thoughts on this. Obviously, we're not experts, but we thought our take would be valuable given what's going on in the market.
So, do you think there's been enough explanation out there of what's a tariff?
I don't. No, I don't. It depends on what you're reading, what you're listening to.
Who may be saying it?
Yeah, who's saying it, what context. Hopefully, we'll unpack some of that today.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go with that. What in general is a simple explanation for the audience of what is a tariff?
Yeah, simplest explanation is it's an additional tax that's charged on goods that are imported into the U.S. It's really something that's trying to put us in a position to have more homegrown businesses have opportunity to excel, bring essentially goods and services that are overseas into the country.
Right. And who is directly paying this tariff?
Typically, it is the consumer. The cost gets passed from the company that's paying the tariff domestically to the consumer.
Whoever's importing it,
Sure.
If I'm ABC company, I decide to order a bunch of products from some country where they've put a tariff on of their products. They come here, and then I get a line item on my invoice when that comes into this country, and I have to pay that. And it's a separate tariff.
Right. And then it's up to the company, hey, are we going to let this eat into our margins, or are we going to pass this on, or some sort of combination, of the two? And that sort of line item, all of the uncertainty around that is obviously what's causing the volatility in the market.
Right.
We know that markets like certainty, businesses like predictability. They need to be able to plan. They need to know what is actually going to stick versus what's going to be something that's temporary. So all of these sorts of headlines are really, are what's driving the ups and downs in the market. Capital Group put together a great piece that simplifies this, and I thought that the first part of their sort of their primer really did a great job of classifying tariffs into different buckets and how to think about them psychologically. Just to unpack really what those buckets are, the first sort of bucket is decoupling. This is something where companies would long-term shift their supply chains to the U.S. This is something where it's viewed more of being a persistent cost, a persistent change to that industry. When we think about something like tech, obviously, everybody's walking around with their phone. There's a lot of components in their phone. All of those components are made in different parts of the world. When that supply chain changes, that's something that takes years and a lot of time to adjust. And when we look at something like autos, for example, that is something that may not be as persistent because it's something that could be taken on and off. Just different industries are going to be affected in different ways.
Gotcha. And the other one, rebalancing, what does that refer to?
Rebalancing is in something that's more focused on trade deficits and boosting demand here domestically. I would put that more in the middle bucket, medium term of really this sort of stage of is something permanent versus short term. That's something that's going to be in the middle bucket.
And the more interesting one is the negotiating one.
Yeah, that's something where everything's a bit of a curveball. Obviously that's going to affect different industries, different companies, different countries. View that in the temporary bucket for sure.
So the country that's issuing these tariffs is utilizing them potentially to negotiate other tariff deals that these foreign countries have against our product.
Right. And, finally, funding. This gets back to, the deficit issue. There's obviously a lot to go into political negotiations and relationships with trade and all of those sorts of things. Obviously, this flows through to our deficit and our overall debt. That's the narrative that's out there. So I would put that in one of these four major categories.
Okay. So where do we see these? I guess I'd like to say where do we see them going? I'm pretty sure I know the answer is where nobody has any idea. How long do you think these lasting could affect the markets and things like that? I think that's the thing that everybody's looking to sort of know.
Yeah. So if we think about that, people have short memories. We went through this in 2018. We saw two major corrections down 20%, and then we eventually got back to the all-time highs in the market. 2019 was a really good year. The longer that uncertainty, persists, obviously the more the market's going to be more volatile. there's no way to predict, hey, this is a certain time frame, or this is when we expect this to subside. But the longer volatility drags out, I would say that the more this administration would pay attention and likely change some of their negotiation tactics.
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about the trade deficit and where that is. And is that necessarily a bad thing? We always say, oh, we're in this trade deficit with these other countries. You go, well, but their products are cheaper than our products. So that's why we're in a deficit as it relates to certain products.
Yeah, I think that depends on what lens you view it through. If you're thinking about that from somebody who's, their job's getting taken or whatnot,
Sure.
That's obviously a different lens than, a business being able to have a better profit. So I'd say, obviously there's no easy answer there. There's no, silver bullet for fixing all of that. I just think what you're reading or what you're listening to should be adding, some context to, the opinions that they're sharing.
Yeah, it's taken 50 years for our trade deficit to get to where it is today relative to where it was 50 years ago. We had no trade deficit in the early 70s.
Right.
Because we were doing more and more of our own manufacturing, and then we sent it overseas because it was cheaper.
Right.
That benefited people because cost of goods and services came down, mostly goods. But then we became a service economy, not necessarily just a manufacturing economy. So
Right.
You want to speak to about that?
Yeah, so this really gets back to, well, what are countries good at? What's their bread and butter? Some countries are great at exporting, hard goods. Our country, just given the education levels, all of the different dynamics in our economy, is more of a service economy.
Yeah.
So it's really just trying to find that match of, hey, what are they good at? Whether it's products, natural resources, versus a country like ours being services. Trying to find the sweet spot of making everybody happy and trying to let everybody grow together.
For me, I think about my Econ 101 class, and I got a degree in economics, and they said, well, if you can make widgets and I can fish really well, then you stick with making widgets. But I need widgets, so you and I should fish, and you and I should trade. So I can get some of your widgets and you can get some fish and everybody's happy.
Yep. And at the end of the day, we're both ahead and, we progress and excel together.
Right. Exactly.
So the last piece here that I thought was interesting was inflation. Obviously the tariff is the line in the sand as far as increasing costs, when goods are brought into the country. So there's no doubt that, the sticker price will go up if, as these are implemented. There's been, opinions on both sides, whether that is something that's temporary or long-term. So let's, unpack some of the different sides of that aspect.
Yeah. I mean, traditionally tariffs that aren't maintained for an extended period of time, because they're a new expense to the consumer, if it's passed on to the consumer, then that certainly is inflationary. The expectation should be that, hey, we're going to be paying more for these goods that are coming into this country because of these tariffs, and that's going to lead towards inflation. On the other hand, people could slow down spending, and that's the other concern is, we're 2/3 of our economy is based on consumer spending. If the consumer stops spending as much, that could pull us into a recession.
Right. And when we've seen really tough days in the market, in the equity market, with the volatility with tariffs, we've seen the bond market gyrate just as much.
Yeah.
We've had days where the recession narrative has gotten a lot of traction and rates have come down because of that expectation that growth is going to be slowing and people will stop spending. And then we've had other days where this sort of inflation narrative has really taken the bond market and yields have gone up. So obviously a lot to be sorted out there and to be determined of how long these things stick around and really what directions rates go.
Right. And all of these things that we're talking about, these different variables that could occur as part of is the main reason, part of the reason that we're seeing that volatility in the markets today, not just in the stock market, but as you mentioned, in the bond market as well. And there's no clear understanding of where are things moving to, and that's sort of creating this volatility.
Right. Great. Well, obviously, hopefully that helps. Just share our thoughts on the topic. Again, this isn't something that's going to go away. In a series of weeks or months, even it's something that's going to be here to stay for a while. So hopefully this helps. And as always, we just ask our listeners, if you enjoyed this content, please pass this along